So, trudging ahead on the topic of the reform, we spoke about Moshe Mendelsohn last week, and since him there have been some very interesting developments where the movement itself in Judaism began to spread and to take root, and began to even branch out a little bit. We'll talk about some of the later branches a little bit later today and then next week also. But the general concept of the reform began with something similar to what you would call several centuries later in the French Revolution, this laïcité, like an official public refraining from showing any religious symbols or any religious signs or any religious acts, where the goal was to facilitate some kind of an integration, to improve the life and the parnasa, the social flexibility of the Jews living in these societies. Naturally, once the ball started rolling, it didn't really stop. You had the very beginning of the reform movement was a little bit incohesive, and over time they began to publish platforms. I was thinking of emailing you guys these things, but you can find them easily enough. This is already more into the 1900s, and specifically the latter half of the 1800s. Sorry, the later quarter of the 19th century, and then they reestablished and reaffirmed some of these beliefs and convictions in a couple of reform Jewish platforms later on. In the beginning, one of the things that they challenged the most was what they call the historical context of the laws. So they didn't necessarily begin by attacking the divine origin of the Torah itself. That certainly came, but it was just a question of time. They would begin by saying, "Tov, maybe some of the halachot that applied back then don't necessarily apply today. Maybe some of the mitzvot or some of the rabbinic enactments that applied back then need not necessarily apply today." I made the case last week, and I would certainly repeat it this week. You can ask these questions, and there are a number of halachot that we would have difficulty, let's say, rationally convincing someone who's totally uninitiated that this is something they should have to abide by or to keep. Ask me, and Shlomo will inevitably, about Yom Tov Sheni Shin Galuyot. I'll tell you, Shlomo, no. It was enacted. We don't have the authority because we hold by the Talmud. And the halacha, as we know it, is basically all explained to us and handed down in the Talmud. We believe that you need a beit din of a certain degree of authority in order to undo such a decree, for the specific reason that we don't undo our decrees so quickly, and it needs to be a complicated process. Otherwise, they're all gone. And if you don't respect the beit din of back then, and you don't respect the beit din of today, you don't have respect for anything. And effectively, your average ordinary citizen is going to be making determinations for the rest of the nation. So we hold like this. It's not easy to convince someone coming from the outside that we believe in the rabbinic establishment, right? Emunat Chachamim is what it's referred to. And there's such a concept in the Gemara. Not, God forbid, the infallibility of the Pope, but the idea is that we believe the Chachamim are the ones who interpreted the halakha. They made certain determinations that we can't necessarily revisit in every generation. We don't have the authority, we don't have the same degree of understanding. So we're very, very hesitant about this.
And when we had the Sanhedrin, could we actually do that?
When we had the Sanhedrin, we probably could have, yeah.
And if tomorrow...
You'll find the Sanhedrin probably enacted more than they undid. Although there was some undoing too. There was. I'll give you some examples of this because these questions are going to come up, and it's very easy to blow the whole thing up, is what I'm saying. Well, once you start chipping away at it, it's very easy to blow it all up. Let me give you some examples. Chazal decreed against blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah.
When it's Shabbat?
When it falls on Shabbat, sorry. That's it. They decreed that. Torah tells you that you have to, Yom HaZikaron, you have to blow the shofar. Yom Teruah, it's referred to as also. They tell you, here's the mitzvah, here's how it's done, how many tkiyot we blow, how many, the calculation, tkiyah, Torah, tkiyah, shvarim, etc. And they themselves, who basically explain to us the requirement, they explain the obligation, what kind of shofar is good, which one isn't, what time you have to blow it during the day, not at night. And they themselves negated what's effectively a mitzvah midoraita. It's a mitzvah tchum aseh. It's a positive, proactive commandment. Get up and do this. And they told us, no, please sit down and don't do this. Why is this? Because they have a concern that in a place where there's no eruv, people are going to carry the shofar on Shabbat, which is asur. It's a classic violation of Hilchot Shabbat, and it would cause people to violate the Shabbat on Rosh Hashanah, which doesn't bode well for all of us being judged at this particular time. Why does the Torah not have such a suspicion? Is the Torah assuming that everyone alive in every Jewish community, everywhere in the world, holds by halacha, and therefore if you observe one mitzvah, you observe them all? Because if that's the case, the Torah gives you a lot of funny hypothetical situations where someone committed an avirah, and how do you punish? What do you mean? Why would anybody commit an avirah? Here you're talking about a well-meaning Jew who wants to observe the mitzvah as spelled out by the Torah, blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, and he can't. Why can't he? Because the Chachamim didn't want it. Well, they intervened in order to protect the halacha of Shabbat. So they basically said, look, there's a potential conflict. One's going to combat the other for our priority. We're going to have to give deference to Shabbat over Yom Tov because this violation is a very severe one. So severe that we're even better off not blowing the shofar on Shabbat than we are on Rosh Hashanah than we are violating the Shabbat. Let me compound the question even more. Chazal said it's not a good sign that Rosh Hashanah comes out on Shabbat, because any year during which they didn't blow the shofar in the beginning, they'll be blowing the shofar by the end. So this is a reference to the other occasions on which you blow the shofar, either during the korbanot, which would be great, on Rosh Chodesh, which would be great, or when we go to war, which is not so great. So the Chachamim themselves are telling you, we did this, we regret having to do this. In fact, it even portends negative omens for the rest of the year. And still it's so important that we didn't undo it. The Reform movement didn't begin by saying all the rabbis are crazy, we have to ignore whatever they said. They began by poking holes at some of these concepts. You see the Chachamim accepted this, but you see they rejected that. You see that this is okay, you see that's not okay. And when you sit there picking things apart, it becomes a very involved discussion. So that's one classic example. Yom Tov Sheni Shem Galuyot, another one of their favorites. Today we have a fixed calendar, we have astronomers, we know exactly where the moon's going to be, what the phase is going to be at a particular time of the day or the night, and therefore this should no longer apply. And as they began undoing some of these things, they went pretty far with it, obviously in favor of leniency. The Reform movement didn't introduce any humrot, which is one of those things, I gotta tell you, when you encounter someone who has an interesting hashkafa, or someone who has particular religious or political inclinations, it helps to see if they have some kind of a balance. Meaning, if you're totally, totally free, and you do whatever you want, and you have no compunctions, you have no regrets, you have no inhibitions, okay, so at least I know where you stand, but that's your ideology. If the Reform movement were making a genuine, honest, survey of halachot and rabbinic enactments, and they actually wanted to make a case, one way or the other, maybe you would say, okay, is it halacha and the observance of halacha that's so important to you, and that's what you'd like to debate and discuss, because that seems to be Chazal's priority. If what you're looking to do is to do something else, you're looking to facilitate assimilation, you're looking to lubricate, the Jew's ability to find a job and get promoted, in order to ease some of the social interactions between Jews and non-Jews, there's an end game here. Eventually this is all going to lead somewhere. It's going to go somewhere. So the accusations in the beginning, even if the claims, most reform movements begin with some kind of grievances. We believe this is too strict. We believe this is too hard. We believe this is too much. And then you start the avalanche, things starts to snowball, and you ultimately lose control. So the reform began with some good intentions. There were some other intentions mixed in there, and ultimately it ended up in a place where it ends up calling into question, and it's important to know this in case you do end up in a discussion with anybody who subscribes to this. They call into question a number of things. This is already from the 1970s. This was very plainly spelled out. It actually happened in stages, just so you know. The Reform movement didn't begin by saying we no longer have to eat kosher food. That was a big scandal at a platform meeting they had in Pittsburgh, where in the, I think it was the 1880s and 1890s, where they actually served shrimp and lobster and crab. And some of the people there were horrified.
At a rabbinic
well, it wasn't
congress or something?
rabbinic per se. It was a convention of Reform Judaism. And some people were shocked. They found that completely scandalous. How could it be that Jews meet up? You don't keep kosher at home, it's one thing, right? Again, you got your Moses Mendelsohn, be Jewish at home and be a mensch outside. But the place was, for some people this was perfectly normal and perfectly natural, and for others, even within the Reform movement, it became an absolute and total scandal. They said, look, this is just ridiculous that we should even have to meet in a place where, forget that we're not eating kosher food, but these are species that couldn't be kosher if you wanted to. And it started to, the pendulum started to swing a little bit back and forth. In the end, obviously, they rejected everything. In the end, they completely undid everything, and we'll talk about what it is that they do believe in. But we'll begin with what they don't, because that's effectively how the attack mounted, against the Orthodox establishment. There were questions about rabbinic authority, and to be fair, rabbinic authority is pretty clearly spelled out in the Torah itself. Al pi hadavar asher yorucha. You do what the Chachamim tell you to do. You don't have the right to deviate to the right or to the left. Incidentally, the right traditionally is understood in the midrashic and Talmudic terminology to represent humrah or a stricture, and the left is represented generally represents leniency. So you might be inclined to be more strict than the Chachamim tell you to, and don't, because there's a danger in it. In fact, the danger of being too strict is that it often comes at the expense of leniency. We call it humrah haba lidei kula. I'm going to be so strict on this that I'm going to end up damaging something else. So I'm so strict in Taharat HaMishpacha, for example, that I couldn't care less about Shalom Bayit or about the other issues that could come from being strict on it. So there's the rabbinic authority, which is, why do we have to accept all these rabbinic enactments? The Torah is already big, and there are many details. Many of us aren't experts in all of it. There's the context of the law, where it was, fine. If you believe that Hashem gave to Moshe all these halachot, some of the stuff really, like Yibum, they would tell you, well, it only applied in a certain time, in a certain place, under certain circumstances. It doesn't make sense in our society today that we should do Yibum. Why? Because family structure has changed, because we don't live in a very tribal system anymore, and that must be the reason for it. If an anthropologist tells you Yibum is basically a way of strengthening family ties within the family group, so okay, now that I have his explanation, I can refute it, and I can throw out the mitzvah along with it. The laws of kashrut were very easy to explain, and this took some time, because people really, that's ingrained. To see Reform Jews eating pork is still a relatively modern thing. A lot of people, even in America, who consider themselves Reformed, don't eat pork. It's just one of those things. They might eat non-kosher beef, they might eat cheeseburgers, but pork is this red line they don't cross.
And it's not the worst in terms of
not
punishment. It's not the worst
not
thing.
at all. In fact, but cheeseburger is just as bad. But our chelev actually, even a regular non-kosher hamburger probably has chelev in it, which is karet. So it is a lot worse. But that's just because the distinction between kosher and non-kosher fat is a lot finer than the distinction between kosher and non-kosher species. But the laws of kashrut, well, these animals were impure, they were unclean. A lot of this is rooted in the Renaissance. It's really important to make that case. Where other religions had superstitions and had beliefs, and science began to refute them. Like if the church believed the earth was flat, and if astronomy has come to the conclusion that it's no longer the case, then Copernicus. I mean, maybe if that's wrong, what else is? What else can we undo? So because people who had this inclination to this tendency towards reform tended to put much more faith in science and in the philosophy of the modern academician, they believed they understood the reasons for the mitzvot, and they started to peel them off one by one. Just get rid of the mitzvot, throw them away. What's the definition of tameh? if the hazir is described as tameh. Tameh because it's unclean. Why? Because in the desert people ate feces, they ate excrement. I mean, if you skin a pig and you take its intestines out, why is it any more or less clean than any other animal? Well, because there's maybe a certain kind of parasite or a certain kind of infections. Okay, everybody's infectious. This should the definition of the laws of kashrut should be reduced to hygiene and sanitation. Is an affront to kashrut. But if you believe you know the reason and that's it, obviously it's a no-brainer to say, hey, today we have clean pork, we can irradiate it, we can sanitize it, you can wash it with salt water, with vinegar, kill the bacteria, or with alcohol. Why should it be any different than anything else? And so that was the mentality. Already in the 19th century, you had hundreds of thousands of German Jews who are not circumcising their kids. Why circumcise your children? Well, back in the day, they considered circumcision to be a much more primitive way of showing your affiliation or your belonging to the Jewish people. But today, maybe it's no longer necessary. You can carry an ID card. You can have friends. You go to Jewish camp. You go to Sunday school. If you go anywhere. The depth of the mitzvah, the depth of the concept, the whole idea that sexual restraint is something that we preach, that we teach, that we believe in. This is what sanctifies us as people, that there's something divine to the connection between a man and a woman, and procreation is really one of the greatest purposes we can fulfill. It was lost on them. So you had this movement away from circumcision. Why? Because it's antique, it's old, it's decrepit as far as institutions go.
What about the reform right now? They circumcise their kids or no?
Not required.
Okay.
Not required. Very little is required of the average reformer. We'll talk about that in a minute. I just want to. I'm being polite and diplomatic and just explaining to you how this developed. We'll talk about what it actually means in a little bit. But yeah, there's a tremendous amount of gawa, of pride, in believing you know the reason or the rationale for something. They call this in English a straw man argument. Have you ever heard this expression? A straw man argument? So, if I'm a political candidate and running against Yon, so I'm going to say, look.
Good luck.
Right. I'm going to say, all you need to do is keep your filters on and stay politically correct and you'll win a certain number of people. If I get up and I say, the man over here to my left, he's going to try to convince you that socialism is a good idea. He's going to raise your taxes. He's going to... Now, I can put all these words in your mouth. I can build up a crazy argument, and then I can dismantle it. And everybody thinks I'm a genius. I didn't even hear it from you. It's a straw man. It's like a fake person. So I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about someone else. And I dress on this guy everything we don't like about everyone. He becomes the evil, the bête noire. This is like the guy that needs to be killed. We burn him in effigy, and everyone feels catharsis. When you take a concept and you believe you know what's behind it, and you believe you know how to represent it, there's no limit to what you can do. So if you believe you know the reasons for the mitzvot, each and every mitzvah becomes optional. I know it, I can do it, I can. Here's another little piece of, and this, some of it's a little bit sophisticated. We have tzaddikim in the Tanakh who also made mistakes, right? Classic example, I can give you a lot. I mean, think of one off the top of your head.
Well, if Moshe didn't go to Israel, it's because he did a sin at some point.
So Moshe did something right. That's an excellent example. He did something that he was punished for. Okay, it's an avirah. It was on purpose. He didn't know. He did know. Maybe he did it because of something else. At the end of the day, he gets punished. And if even Moshe as a Navi gets punished, I can say, look, I better work on myself because even someone as perfect as Moshe has the occasional imperfection. Or I can say, Moshe, after turning the world inside out and fasting and starving himself and praying and learning, even to him, Hashem, punishments come and go, and it's not so clear that he was always perfect all the time. He made mistakes. The Torah tells you a mistake that Moshe made, first of all, assuming it's a mistake. Second of all, like my mitzvot should be like his mistakes. I wish I should reach a level where the rewards that I get are like when he gets punished. He's one example. Let me give you something a little bit more fierier. How about David the Melech or Shlomo, for that matter?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the life and times of the aforementioned?
Well, the Bathsheba story with David
So
HaMelech.
David and Bathsheba, this was he was proud of this, he was embarrassed about it, it was a very, very, very complicated story. Now, theology is lost on these people. They'll tell you, Tom, David HaMelech becomes for them basically a corrupt politician, and for them he represents the whole rabbinic establishment. You'll hear this very often from people who study Reform Judaism, JTS, the conservatives as well, that that Hazal, the Tanaic and Amoritic literature, the Tanaim and the Amorim, the Mishnah, the Midrash, the Gemara, and the Zohar, they claim that they whitewash the tzaddikim. They always make them look good. So David HaMelech with Bathsheba, it was a tremendous attraction. They were created for each other from the 7 days of creation. The Gemara says a lot of things about him that would lead you to believe, this is a tremendous relationship. The two of them felt it nishmatically, and it was just a matter of time before it happens. But it happened at the wrong time. And they got punished for it. They lost a child. David HaMelech was punished for it. He was mocked. He was ridiculed for the rest of his life. People embarrassed him about this. It wasn't something he was proud of. This is not l'havdil. Today's modern politician gets caught with a girl, hey, you got me, it is what it is, but it's no big deal. And then you move on with your life and you run for president.
Or your wife runs for president.
Right, your wife runs for president, yeah. You run back to find more girls. So, if you look at that story with a critical eye and a bit of a secularist approach, you come to the conclusion that David HaMelech is the king and he can do things that I'm not allowed to do as a member of the proletariat. Right? I'm a lower class citizen. The rabbis are in control. I made some references last week. You remember the French Revolution? Okay? It's a revolution against both the corruption of the monarchy and by extension the aristocracy. Who are the aristocrats? People close to the king. So the king is a totalitarian. He has power over everything. And there are the people who are with him, which is basically, him, the aristocracy, and to a large extent, the church. The king rules with the permission, the authority, under the auspices of, in conjunction with the church. There's always a perverse relationship between the church and politics, and this is the nature. This is, in fact, medieval European history. The church is inextricably involved in the politics of the time. The Jewish reformers started looking at the rabbinic institution the way Martin Luther looks at the Vatican and its agents, the cardinals, the bishops, the priests, etc. They're the superior class. They are permitted to do certain things that we're not. There are examples of this. The Gemara says that Talmid Chacham is expected to have sharp eyes, so if he notices an item that he lost, he can take it. If it's someone else, you have to give simanim, you have to prove. There's a number of examples of things where we cut a little bit of slack to people who are Talmidei Chachamim. We never recommend people should go around taking advantage of this. And today, who calls himself a Talmid Chacham, that he should exempt himself from many of these halachot, or that he should write himself entitlements to certain things? You have to tread very, very lightly. But at the end of the day, they were living in a time when people are very critical of organized religion. They're very critical of political hierarchies. They were critical of any process that wasn't really democratic, right? Because at the end of the day, the American, French, and subsequent revolutions in Germany, Italy, etc., were all, meant to bring about democracy. And so here you have a system where they're saying, look, you had the corruption of the Kohanim back in the time of Beit HaMikdash. We've been through this. We spoke about it. We acknowledge it was there. It was wrong. That's not to say we don't need Kohanim. It just means we need Kohanim who aren't corrupt. But yes, it's true. If there are Kohanim who are corrupt and who, buy the Kiuna Gdola, they use their influence, they sell, they buy and sell political positions, we're better off without them. That's not our goal. Our goal is to reestablish the Kiuna, but it has to be in the context of righteous, honest people doing what Hashem told them to do. If not, the whole system is meaningless, which is why Hashem destroyed Beit HaMikdash. So they have suspicions of the rabbinic institution, and looking back through the eyes of a Bible critic, they'll tell you, sure, David HaMelech also allows himself to do something nobody else does. In his case, it's a little bit worse, because he actually had Uriah Hitti, sent back to war, where it was. I mean, he effectively tells them, send him somewhere where he's going to be killed, because he explains he rebelled against David in a certain way, but if it was by refusing to go back to war, David tells him, "I'm going to go back to your wife." He didn't tell him what happened, but that would have been a sign that she was never divorced to begin with, and that it would have been adultery. So he's not proud of it. He did it. He was certainly criticized for it, and he was certainly punished for it. Both by people and by people humiliated him and made his life miserable. And Natan Navi tells him he's going to have a child who's going to die. One of his children is going to try to usurp the kingdom from him. It's not like he had an easy or peaceful life, and it's not like the timing of this relationship was perfect and something that he saw a lot of blessings from. The relationship itself, yes, over time. Shlomo HaMelech is born from this relationship. Shlomo HaMelech, if you're familiar with his history, has 300 wives and 700 concubines. Now, there's a midrash that actually says the yod, the letter yod of lo yarbelo nashim, how he's not allowed to have too many wives. The yod cried before HaKadosh Baruch Hu and said, Ribono shel Olam, you gave the Torah, you wrote me into it, and him, the wisest of all men, has violated me. Just this one letter yod. It's interesting. The yod here, Yarbe, they call this the Jussive, Jussive tense. It's like what he shouldn't do, but we use the future tense to express it. Arabic has a similar concept. So it's not even the whole word Yarbe. It's like the yod that means what he shouldn't do, that represents just what the king ought not to do as the king, was violated. And so Shlomo HaMelech was punished for having violated or insulted the smallest letter in the Torah, the letter Yod. It says, he's not allowed to have too many wives, lo yarbelo nashim, lest his heart should deviate from Hashem and it should go elsewhere. Later we're told in Sefer Melachim that because Shlomo HaMelech had so many wives, and because they had so many idolatries they brought with them, that he constructed an altar and he worshipped Avodah Zarah. And the Gemara says, Chas v'shalom, we should believe such a thing. But the pasuk was written in such a way as to humiliate Shlomo HaMelech, as to embarrass him. Part of his punishment for believing that he could exempt himself from one of the mitzvot. And it's a fascinating midrash, because the midrash says, what was he thinking? Shlomo HaMelech saw this letter Yod, he sees the lo yarbeh, and he says, why is this mitzvah given? The mitzvah is given so that the king shouldn't lose his loyalties, shouldn't lose his priorities, shouldn't get too involved in women or in family or whatever confuses his foreign or domestic policy. He should stay loyal to Hashem and focused on this. Because the Torah gives you a rationale behind it, Shlomo HaMelech says, I'm going to have extra wives, and this is not going to happen to me because I know that I'm stronger than this. I know that I'm better than this. It's not going to happen. And then the midrash says, Shlomo HaMelech, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai actually says in the Midrash, Shlomo HaMelech would have preferred to clean out toilets with his bare hands, like to clean out sewers with his bare hands, than have this pasuk written about him. Not that he did it, but that it's as if he did it. Because refusing to accept one of the mitzvot of the Torah is tantamount to Avodah Zarah. It's as if he did the same thing. Now, you can look at that story and you can say, this is Shlomo HaMelech. As wise as he was, he made a mistake. He tried to undo one mitzvah of the Torah, and look at the whole mess that came of it. And he himself regretted it. And he talks about it. He regrets having done this. And maybe he had good intentions. Maybe he thought this was going to save the Beit HaMikdash. It was going to save the nation from exile. We spoke about this another time. Or you can look at it the way a Bible critic would look at it. And you can say, well, because he's the king and because he has a tradition from his father, the king can do whatever he wants and he can exempt himself from certain things that are obviously forbidden for a member of the proletariat. These lower class Jews have to obey the mitzvot. That's how we keep them in control. And the upper class gets away with things like this. Kohanim get away with murder. The kings get away with adultery. They do whatever they want. So, in the same vein as the European movement of criticism of organized religion, criticism of aristocracy and monarchy, criticism of all these institutional abuses as perceived by the Europeans, it became very fashionable for Jews to feel and discuss the same things. at some point, and it wasn't right away. One of the very next items called into question was the divine origin of the Torah. This has been an issue that the Reform movement has choked on for a while, and they finally came down on the other side of it. In the beginning, it was the Torah was given to Moshe, and that Moshe interpreted it somehow and passed on what he passed on. Then it became the Torah was inspired by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but Moshe had more of a free hand in commanding what he commanded. Some of it could be for spiritual reasons, some of it could be for political, structural reasons, organizational reasons, etc. Then it became the Torah wasn't really given by God. It's not prophecy, because if it was, then it should be timeless. There's no reason we should have to change it. The Torah doesn't provide for a mechanism of changing the mitzvot. And here, they basically broke with tradition and said, Tov, Moshe was a very wise, very intelligent man. He was a very well-intended man. But they don't believe there's any divine origin, and therefore no divine compulsion to observe the mitzvot as written. It was nice for that time. It doesn't work for us anymore. And today they've abandoned any concept of divinity or divine origin to the Torah. Divinity is something you can explore, you can seek, you can discuss, but they don't believe the Torah was given by God to the Jewish nation, just that it was rules that kept us together as a society.
But even the Christians believe that the Torah was given by God.
Correct. Even some of the most reformed or not at all religious Christians believe there is some kind of divine origin to the Torah. At the same time, they believe it doesn't apply anymore to the New Testament, to the Old Testament, because, again, consistent with the Reform movement, they believe that the Torah was once divinely inspired, but it was replaced by another divine inspiration, which they believe is the New Testament. So, if already you can chip away at the Tanakh and say this is old, outdated, there's an upgrade you haven't made, it doesn't really stop anywhere. So what happens is that this is very interesting. There was a movement of non-circumcision, which they presented as cruelty to the children. It made sense back then. The times were much more barbaric. It was like a tribal ritual marking. Africans do these things in their nose and their ear, other parts of the face, whatever. So it became fashionable for the prominent Reform Jews to refuse to circumcise their children. In fact, there was a famous story in the years building up to the war that there were many country clubs in Germany that refused entrance to Jews. And they would ask you on the application if you were Jewish or not. So there was one guy who filled out the application, and he didn't write that he was Jewish. And when they asked him about his ethnic identity, he said, he was born to Jewish parents. His ancestry is Jewish. And the guy says to him, well, I'm sorry if that's the case, we just can't let you in. And he says, no, I want you to know that I'm proudly uncircumcised. And I didn't circumcise any of my children either. And the response that he got in German was kind of beschnitten, kind of unbeschnitten, like no circumcised ones and no uncircumcised ones. We don't care if you circumcise yourself or not. You're a Jew as far as we're concerned. Yeah. And that was the line, which was, we don't care if you're Reform or Orthodox, we're offended by who you are, and we're therefore not going to give you entrance, grant you access to the country club. So that's the long and short of it. In terms of our interaction with them, because I'm not talking about, we have a conservative movement we're going to talk about next week, and the Reconstructionist movement probably at the same time, because they're much more modern as far as movements go. Where does this become a question or an issue, not just hashkafically, but also halachically? To the Orthodox Jew, the well-meaning, observant Orthodox Jew goes to a synagogue, pays membership, etc. Well, there's the issue of conversion. If you present yourself as a legitimate Jewish movement, maybe if you tell me that you knew for a fact that all the members of your community were all Jews and descended of Jews and only married Jews, then we could tell, we know who's Jewish and who's not. What if someone from the outside wants to become a Reform Jew? What if one of the members of your congregation has a secretary, very spiritual woman, and she would like to become Jewish? You basically start to undo all the requirements of Yichus. And once you have no standards for conversion, I'll explain to you in a minute what that meant, you've effectively created a situation in which no one outside of your community can recognize your congregants or their descendants.
I'm going to challenge you on this.
Okay.
Because we had a discussion a few months back about conversions and the difference between conversions in countries where you have an organized national Beit Din like Israel or France.
And naturally, all the conversions that the Israeli Rabbanut has officiated are all impeccable and beyond reproach.
I'm not saying that.
Even when done by the hundreds of thousands.
I'm saying there's probably I mean, you're talking about the Russians, but that's another story.
Ethiopian. Okay.
Maybe Ethiopians as well. But when you have some kind of... and I'm not sure which side of the balance I'm tilting onto, because I see pros and cons everywhere, but when you have a state organization, the Consistoire in France, for example, they have very strong requirements, and I would never challenge anybody who converted in France to...
You've never met a convert in France that made you ask questions about,
For all the converts that I met, I haven't... there's nobody that I... some just go back all the way, that's another story, but...
I think France and England are like very, very strict.
They're very strict.
I know France
like
to be
4
very
to 7 years.
England, I think, is not as strict, but I think the Beit Din is more on top of the people afterwards also.
In France, I know some
This is a very interesting
huge
question in
challenges
general,
for
and this is already...
It's all about quantity. It's like
Right.
supply chain. You know what I'm saying? The less you're producing, the
supply
better the
and
quality is.
demand. Well, you see,
It's true. Like France, there's not that many
first of
converts.
all, we really have to... we need to... what are our halachic requirements, and what are the halachic expectations of the process? If you look at the Gemara, the requirements for Giur seem to be relatively basic. I'm not going to say minimal, but basic. I mean, you have to accept the mitzvot. You don't need to know all of them. You don't even need to know most of them.
You have to know in France to be a convert more than the average Jew that goes to shul on Shabbat.
Right. And again, to be fair, I use the analogy sometimes that if one of the principal managers or one of the head partners at Goldman Sachs spends half his day playing golf, it's only because he started out once a long time ago as an intern and did a lot of crazy work and didn't sleep and ate Chinese food. So, yes, it's true there are Jews who don't know anything, but somewhere along the line, their ancestors, their parents, their grandparents, great-grandparents, whoever converted, it's ultimately all converts, at some point or another, someone accepted all the mitzvot, circumcised their children, went to the mikveh. That was those were the terms of entry. Now, do we have an obligation to accept the Gerim? Absolutely. Do we have an obligation to set up a system that facilitates responsible Giur? Definitely. At very least by extension, if not by direct command. We have to have Batidin. One of the things Batidin do is this, and we aren't allowed to reject the Gerim for no good reason. How and why countries set different standards isn't necessarily a testament to their halachic competence. And I say that because this is the theme for tonight. There's such a thing as being strict, such a thing as being lenient. Very often stricture here is a leniency over there, and vice versa. Has France turned away many perfectly legitimate halachic girim?
Probably.
I would assume so.
I
would assume so. To what productive end?
I know bad stories of people who were really interested in almost into that, and
I know plenty of them.
They gave up.
They gave up. It took too long, cost too much time, cost too much money, cost too much whatever. So, if a woman wants to convert and she's in her mid-30s and she knows it'll be a process that's going to go on for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and she knows it's going to be difficult for her as a Gioret to marry anyway, it's just a little bit more, it'll take some more time and some more practice to be fluent in some of these things. So maybe she shouldn't even bother trying, right? So it's fair. We're going to basically say you can be Jewish, but you can't have kids because you're at this age that, because of our procedures, it's a protocol. We have a protocol, and the protocol is that you should wait 5 years before we allow you to go to the mikveh. So there's a lot of stupidity in having these one-size-fits-all policies. Now, maybe they make it last 5 years because it used to last 30 days and There are lots of
No, I agree. I agree with you 100%.
This is part of the genius of having a central planning authority that decides for everybody what they can and can't do. Here in America, you have competing batidin. So if someone says, well, I want to be a Reform convert, so he gets a certificate from a Reform rabbi, I can read it and I can tell you a mile away if it's competent or not. There are different communities, and the reason it's good to have, hashgacha on a more local level is because what you require of someone in Omaha, Nebraska, might not be what you require of someone in Flatbush.
Yes, but
there might be legitimate reasons for doing things a little bit differently.
But someone who converts in Omaha, my kid wants to marry a girl who is converted in Omaha.
Mm-hmm.
How do I know all of these? How do I know that okay, the guy says Orthodox, but it's not like the Orthodox rabbi that we saw in the movie a couple weeks ago?
Open Orthodox.
Yeah, so it's a very big challenge.
These become very big questions. This isn't the first time that we're having these discussions. I mean, throughout our history, you had these questions, you had these problems. Different communities are hold differently. By the way, in the time of the Mishnah,
it just worked by the law of the market.
Look at the Mishnah in Masechet Chulin, if you want a classic example of this. There are three opinions on whether or not chicken is actually a vegetable. According to Rabbi Akiva, chicken is a surah to eat with milk midoraita. According to Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Yosef, it's not only mutar midoraita, it's mutar midorabanan. And in his region, they ate poultry with cheese and milk. This is a Tana. I'm talking about 2,300 years ago. And then according to Rabbi Huda, it's mutar midoraita and it's asur midorabanan. So you had communities, this is going back quite a while, but still. In my community, we eat, pheasant with cream cheese. In your community, you hold that I'm violating a sur midoraita, and Shlomo says, Tov, we hold midorabanan, you shouldn't do it, but if that's how your rabbi holds, that's okay. You boil it down to the basics. Wherever this person came from, did he or she accept all the mitzvot, even the ones that he or she didn't know about? Did you give them extreme examples of mitzvot? So they can't say, well, I didn't know there was something that strict or something that lenient. I mean, they knew what they were getting into in general. They committed to learning further. You convert them then, and they continue to learn. Now, today, that society is a big mess, and Rabbanut is an even bigger mess, it becomes a lot more complicated to universalize these standards. But that's what the rabbi is for. Look into it, test the person, check it out. And in the worst case scenario, you can have them redo the process. If they're already married and they have kids, we try to avoid that at all costs. But if necessary, you do it. The Reform movement basically broke with orthodoxy, and you have to appreciate the fact. I'll talk about this maybe if not next week, the week after. The rabbinic response to it was also, cataclysmic. Most of the rabbanim wanted away from it at all costs. And there were some rabbanim that fought to keep some of the people who were in the middle, who were undecided, in the fold. Today, this is an election year, 2016, right? You know that all the campaigning and all the debating and all, it's really only done for the 5 or 6 swing states and for the independent votes. Like, everyone on the right is basically assuming every registered Republican is going to vote for them. Everyone on the left assumes every registered Democrat is voting for them. The entire election process is only about those people who are lucky enough to call themselves independent, and therefore maybe you're fiscally conservative and socially liberal, maybe socially conservative and fiscally liberal. And, the whole war becomes about who's in the middle, because the sides are already clearly drawn. So, Rav Shem Raphael Hirsch, for example, was one of those who he had a two-pronged approach. The people who really believe in this need to be distanced from the community. They're just poisoning people and need to be thrown out. The people who don't know any better, or who are just ethnic Jews who happen not to have an education, people who identify with the Reform movement as not as an ideology or as principles that they follow, but rather as a reflection of their level of religious practice. Those are the people it's a mitzvah asip. That's how he held, and he wasn't the only one. The Malbim did the same thing in Bucharest, Romania, as he did in Germany. This became a real war amongst Orthodox rabbis, because it was easy to say in a place like Poland or Russia, get rid of them, throw them out, they're just Christians. In a place like Germany, where you had the overwhelming majority was like this, Rav Hirsch was saying, you want me to cut them all out and throw them out? We'll lose them and their generations to come. We need to make efforts. They had questions on things. For example, Rav Hirsch was very criticized for this. The Reform started to copy the church organ music, which even they didn't see as idolatrous. They saw it wasn't like the music was composed specifically for Jesus. It was nice music, and they want to go to a synagogue and have an uplifting experience, and music was a part of that. Rav Hirsch didn't allow anybody to play instruments in the Bet Knesset. He did institute children's choirs, though. Just like they had choral singing in church, he introduced something completely new that was never done before, at least not for thousands of years, into the Bet Knesset. And he was criticized in Poland, he was criticized in other countries. People came out against him. How could you do this? It's Christian, it's Dorkei Agoyim. You copied something from non-Jewish culture, non-Jewish society, and something that's used very specifically for idolatrous purposes. And Rav Hirsch said, if it's halachically permissible, and I can get away with doing it, and I can keep a few of these people in my community so that their kids go to a Jewish school, I'm going to do it. He was very harshly criticized at the time, and history exonerates him. I mean, he was doing his best to keep these people in the fold. A very important point to make about the Reform and the people who consider themselves Reformed today. The overwhelming majority of these people, I'm talking way beyond 99%, don't have the first clue as to what the Torah is, what they believe, what they don't believe. For them, Reform was a matter of convenience. It was just the movement that required me to do the least, and therefore where I go on Yom Kippur because I go to shul once a year. It wasn't like, and it wasn't true then, certainly not true today, that people actually opened books and studied and compared and contrasted and came to this conclusion that Orthodoxy is rigid, Orthodoxy is stiff, Orthodoxy, it's outdated, it's antiquated. That wasn't it never was the argument. You had a few people at the top who did, and the rabbis of their time branded these people as heretics. They branded them right away as psychopaths that were looking to destroy the Torah and to secularize Jewish society. Your average run-of-the-mill Jew who tells you, I'm Reform, doesn't mean I believe in the Reform. He'll tell you, I'm about as observant as your average Reform Jew is, which is to say, not at all. There's a huge difference between believing in it and propagating it and basically saying, look, I just go where the flow goes. The only synagogue in my parents' community was a Reform one, or we drive to the local Reform temple because my parents aren't ready to stop driving on Shabbat. So there's a distinction to be made. Nonetheless, you have this issue of conversion was huge. The issue of marriage and divorce was also huge. It requires a lot of skill. To officiate a wedding, not so much. To write a get, yes, it's actually a very involved process. Lots of halachot, lots of technicalities. As is the question they had this question came about the Ethiopians and other groups. We talked about the Karaites as well a few weeks ago. It's much easier to end up halachically married than it is halachically divorced.
So you
the get process is much more involved than the ketubah. So if their marriages are marriages and their divorces aren't divorces, or they're getting married in a shul with a rabbi and they're getting divorced in a German court, we have problems. We have serious problems. This is already a question of mamzerut. It's a question of yichus. It becomes a tremendous issue. And they'll tell you you're just looking to throw them out and divide and create machloket, and I'll tell you it's just a very complicated issue. It's asur for us to marry mamzerim, and that becomes a big problem. Most of these rabbis already then,
yeah, but if the
certainly
converts,
more so today,
if the convert women are not even converts.
If the converts?
If a convert woman is not even convert and she has a Jewish wedding and she has no Jewish get, what about the kids?
So the kids are not Jewish to begin with,
The
which
kids
is
are
why
not
they're not
Jewish.
mamzerim, which is a great thing, but they have to convert. So it's asur to marry them. So that becomes an issue. Circumcision, tov, it's up to the individual. If he wants to marry an Orthodox Jewish girl, he's going to have to circumcise himself. If his parents didn't do it for him. Marriage, divorce, mamzerut, and this whole concept of giur is where it becomes really complicated. Now here's a better halachic question for you. A guy, you're a rabbi, and a guy from your community tells you, I met a really nice girl from a Reformed temple in Tennessee. Right? They don't have records of her great-grandparents, don't have records of her grandparents. Now what do I do? Very tough question. I once asked Rav Mordechai Willig, he's one of the Danim at YU, who told me, I'll be honest with you, it is getting more and more difficult to answer that question. A time will come by which it'll just be presumed that these people aren't Jewish and they have to convert if they want to, and many people hold that way now anyway.
But it's easy if they're not Jewish in a way. Because
it's easy
if they're not
for
Jewish,
you.
they're not Jewish, no.
But go tell her that she's not Jewish and she has to convert, and go tell her that conversion means accepting all the mitzvot, and it means a course of study, and if it's in France, God forbid, it's going to take 5 years, and she's already in her 30s.
It's still easy. You still have a way out compared to if she's a mamzeret. There's nothing you can do.
That's encouraging. Right? So,
I was trying to see the upside.
There's not so much we can do. So, at the same time, there is an upside. The upside is that the number of people who actually study Reform Judaism and actually seek to perpetuate it is tiny. There are very few people who really care what Reform means or stands for. They later adopted some concept that they call Tikkun Olam, which is a very Kabbalistic concept, but that it's important to do chesed in the world. It's important to give money. They give money to universities, to schools, to hospitals, to old age homes, to wherever you want. Charitability, it's nice to be charitable. Most religions appreciate that. They don't really believe in all that much. So it's not, you basically are converting them in a way. In other words, there's such a system of belief behind Torah that it's involved. No one becomes an accidental tourist in a conversion bid'in. It doesn't happen that way. And if you had a fling or an interest in a guy or a girl, it'll dissipate by the time you make it through, or maybe it's the right thing, it's just a matter of time, and you figure it out. It becomes very difficult to pass this on to your kids as a system of beliefs, because you really don't believe it very much. And so a lot of these Reform Jews basically went with the flow. It's not so much that they thought about, this mitzvah makes sense, that one doesn't, do this and doing that. It was a movement that took the focus off of Torah observance, that focused more on the national, ethnic, level of interaction with people. We're a group, this preserves the group, this is good for the group, bad for the group. The rabbis did what they did then. Today, lay leaders or secular leaders or people who aren't necessarily religious or prophets, also have the authority to make certain decisions. It goes without saying that the Reform movement openly embraces homosexuality. I think on the heels of our prior series, we should mention this. They have no hesitations, no compunctions, no inhibitions, no recommendations. Just they recommend they're totally fine with gay rabbis, gay and lesbian rabbis, and women rabbis. Not even.
There's a transsexual one that is being ordained soon or something like.
Really.
I read something about that.
Training. Well, just a matter of time. I remember reading specifically in one of these platform declarations or whatever it was, that they had a whole item on sexuality, how they advised and recommended people to discover God through their own sexuality, if that means heterosexuality, homosexuality, masturbation, all sorts of crazy behaviors, like whatever makes you feel good is basically what they're saying. Rav Meir Kahana once made the point that the Reform movement, in order to remain relevant and continue raising money and continue, administrating communities, was forced with every successive generation to accept more and more devious behavior as tolerable, and more questionable people as members of the community, just for the sake of not losing them. In other words, their fear, just like the modern, super progressive parent, is that you don't want to lose your kids. The important thing is that you have a relationship with them, so you tell them everything they do is okay. Whatever they do is moral relativism. It's fine, it's okay, you're gay, come be a part of our community, be open about it, be proud, it's cool, we just don't want to lose your membership. You don't believe in the state of Israel, you side with the Palestinians, that's fine, that's okay, that's cool, as long as you come to shul, pay membership, come on Sunday, we'll let it slide. You don't believe in the divine origin of the Torah, you don't believe in conversion as a process, you don't believe in anything. You basically diluted it to the point that there's nothing you need to believe in order to participate, which is offensive to no one. It's a movement without any content to it. They're not really selling you on anything. They'll tell you charitability, be nice, do good things, donate money, but they don't really believe in all that much beyond that. So today, obviously, kashrut is already optional. The UJA is a good place to go if you want to see reform in practice. It's called a federation. It's basically, unfortunately, the case
It's very sad.
Yeah, the UJA, for example, doesn't, when they do catered events, they're not necessarily kosher. They don't even try to accommodate Orthodoxy. I have two friends who worked at the UJA, who are probably two of the only Orthodox people on staff. One of them made Aliyah, and the other one just retired now after she's expecting her second child, and she doesn't want to do it anymore. So she was like, even in like office parties, they would have in the UJA.
Should we not assume that what we do is kosher?
The UJA?
Yeah.
They wouldn't, unless someone made very specific requests to the contrary, most of these people couldn't care less. In fact, some of them even advocate for not eating from shechita because they believe that, using electrocution or using a bolt gun is more humane. And what's really important is that we be humane and not that we observe antiquated rules. It's Bible criticism one way or the other. I mean, it's the same thing.
I told somebody, I went to the dinner, they had a Wall Street dinner at the Hilton.
Uh-huh.
It was like about 5,500 people. Raised like $120 million, whatever, in one night. It was 4 guys with yarmulke. The Jewish Wall Street dinner.
Wait, Orthodox guys or guys that put them on just...
I don't know, whatever. Me being one of the 4. Even the mayor of Jerusalem that spoke wasn't wearing his yarmulke.
Well, yeah, the politics in Israel is...
No, I mean, it's not a question of politics. It's like a Jewish organization.
Still, you want people to take you seriously.
Right. You know what I'm saying? You're representing the Jews.
There's lots of questions we could ask about this. I mean, I wish we could answer some of them. They're the overwhelming majority, the people who technically define themselves as Reform. And by the way, if you look at the Pew Institute, every 10 years they do a census of the Jewish population. They ask them all kinds of questions. It's all self-identification. It's not the federal government tracking people. Every year, Reform loses hundreds of thousands of people to atheism, like to alt or agnosticism. It's amazing. You ask these people what they believe in, they'll tell you. The average Jew is less likely to believe in God than the average Christian. That's one of these Pew Institute conclusions. Now, who they consider Jewish, who answers these questions, could be some people answer the questions are Jewish to begin with, but...
Yeah, there's someone who says he's Jewish.
But the likelihood of these people actually acknowledging a belief in God, a divine origin to the Torah, it's amazing. It's amazing how far we've come. But this is people who voluntarily fill out a survey. It's several thousand of them, so it's not a very small sample size. It's pretty impressive. I mean, the damage is already done at this point. The question is just what do we do from here and how do we handle it? So it's interesting. We'll talk next week about it. The conservative movement was really a step in the other direction. They were trying to rectify and repair the damage by pulling back towards the right, but not all the way to the right, because they acknowledged some of the grievances too. And on the topic of intermarriage, just so you know, the early theologians amongst the reformists will they'll point you to places like Yaakov Avinu having 12 sons who all married Kenaniot Shnidgaru. So what does that mean? It means that conversion is a fluid thing. Again, if you're a member of the tribe, you can take whatever you want as a woman, and we'll consider her Jewish. They point at these things and define them the way they want to, but those are classic arguments that they make. So let's take a quick 2-minute break and we'll continue some Hilchot Rabit.